evening to everyone present here tonight in Malaysia. My name is Yu and I will be your host for tonight. On behalf of the JPO family, we'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone tuning in for tonight's broadcast. We hope that everyone is doing well and staying safe indoors. A friendly reminder to maintain good hygiene at all times and maintain social distancing when heading out. To anyone who is interested in sharing tonight's broadcast, a live feed is being shared on the JPO YouTube channel. Do like and subscribe to the channel so you can receive live notifications. If you have any questions you'd like to ask, please feel free to type them out in the Q&A section down below in Zoom and the chat box in YouTube. A recording of the webinar will also be uploaded onto the channel later on. Adrian Brown comes from a distinguished line of Sir Adrian Bolt's most gifted pupils. After graduating from the Royal Academy of Music in London, he studied intensively with Sir Adrian for some years. He remains the only British conductor to have reached the finals of the Korean Conductors competition. In fact, the Berlin Philharmonic was the first professional orchestra he conducted. Sir Adrian wrote, "He has always impressed me as a musician of exceptional attainments who has all the right gifts and ideas to make him a first-class conductor. For many years, he was proud to work with many youth orchestras, not least the National Youth Orchestra of Great Britain. He was music director of the nationally famous Stone League Youth Orchestra for over 40 years. He has conducted much Wagner, Acts 1 and 3 of the Valkyrie, along with other excerpts from The Ring, Tristan, and The Master Singers. Adrian Brown was one of 100 musicians presented with a prestigious Classic FM award at their 10th birthday honors celebration in June 2002. In summer of 2013, he was awarded the Making Music NFMS Lady Hilary Grooves Prize for services to community music, a much appreciated and admired honor. Tonight's interview features Adrian Brown with his topic about conducting music as an international language. As our JPO family attendees are mostly students ranging from primary school to college, their parents and their teachers, the sharing of knowledge and advice you have for all of us is invaluable and greatly appreciated. The JPO is very honored to have Adrian joining in as our guest for tonight. I hope that you will all join me in giving him a warm welcome. Welcome, Adrian.
Hello there. Greetings from London. Lovely to be here. Thank you for asking me. Great honor for me too.
No problem. Thank you for being here with us. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us today. So to start off today's interview, what can you tell us about the video we had just watched?
The video you watched was the first movement of the Dvorak Cello Concerto, and it was recorded some 6 or 7 years ago with my Bromley Symphony Orchestra, which I've been conducting for 40 years as well. And it was a unique occasion. It was the first time this youngster, the soloist Daniel Ben, he comes from a very well-known political family actually in this country, but him and his sister were loyal members of my youth orchestra in Stoneleigh. They grew up with me, and that was he's played the Elgar Concerto with me many times, and the Dvorak, Daniel has, and was a debut with my own orchestra as well, doing the Elgar. And the other interesting thing about that performance was that it was one of the first performances to use the new edition by Jonathan Del Mar of the Dvorak Cello Concerto. It's a very famous but difficult piece to conduct. It's tricky to accompany, balance. And the interesting thing about it was that the piece, although so famous, was known for many years with many, many mistakes and misprints in it. And that is now all been corrected and sorted out by Jonathan and a little bit of help from me. So that was quite a unique occasion.
All right. Thank you very much for sharing with us about the video. So can you tell us what inspired you in June 1963 to become a musician?
Well, that was the culmination of a gradual build-up of being with my parents in music. They weren't professionals, but my mother sang in the local choir. My father was in the Ipswich Orchestra in 1953 and took a then very young Sir Colin Davis to the station, and that was his first job. My grandfather was a violinist as well. I didn't know him. He died very young in 1920, but he was a good violinist and the conductor of a Salvation Army band. And then I went to a very good school in Ipswich, Northgate. I was very lucky to go there, music master with a good tradition. And we were in that year invited, as we were only down the road, as it were. Ipswich is not far from the home of the great composer Benjamin Britten. And in 1963, he'd written a piece called Psalm 150. And on that day, in June 24th, we'll always remember it, I took part in the first performance of that work. I was, what was I, 13 or something? We all got changed, and we were in the Jubilee Hall, tiny hall on the Suffolk coast in Aldborough. Britten, of course, conducted. We got to see him and meet him and work and play for him. And we all got changed on the beach because there was nowhere else to change. It was extraordinary. I loved every minute of it. And Ben Britten was just marvelous with youngsters. And that was an inspiring day. And I've never forgotten it. And I made up my mind I wanted to do music that day.
Thank you. So, just a personal question, like, does it affect that being like, because you have a family of professional musicians or musically trained, will you say that it's a very huge effect that made you wanting to become a musician? Or because some of the children, they don't really want to pursue although they have a musical background, but they don't really want to pursue as a musician, like in the future.
I understand what you're saying. Now, can I make it clear to you that my parents were not professional musicians? They were very good amateur musicians. There was a lot of good amateur music making. My father would have been a good violinist, but believe it or not, we're of the age in the 1930s when, of course, talkies came out. Many musicians were playing for the movies, and they got thrown out of work when the movies became sound. There was a lot of that. So there was a lot of musicians unemployed. There was an enormous amount of it. So my father didn't take it up as a career. He became a printer and wanted me to be a printer. He was a very good printer too. He was very distinguished in that. But no, I wasn't under any pressure. It was around. It wasn't, my music background wasn't particularly what I'd call a very serious classical one. I had to have it rammed down my throat. It was quite light music. We wouldn't go to I took it on board much earlier with more serious music. But I mean, yes, of course, it will help to have somebody who understands a little bit about what the music can be. Sometimes if you've got very musical parents, it can be oppressive and can be, how can I put it? It can be overwhelming, and therefore you're obliged as a youngster to take up music. I didn't feel I wanted to do it because I wanted to do it. I was lucky. I had very wise parents. I was an only child, and they funded me for lessons. If I needed it, we could do it. And my father, mum and dad, they were lower middle class people, and my dad was a printer, got enough money and I went to a good grammar school for free, and we had a bit of what spare was used on my education. But a lot of people I've seen who bring up their children, they're musicians, and they want to bring them up like themselves. And that, I think, is a terrible mistake. Because I think it depends what your genetic makeup, what you're like as a person, whether you're good enough. You can't force it. You can't force it at all. For instance, I mean, both of Daniel's parents, you've just been watching his cellists. They're amazingly talented musical family, but neither his parents are musical at all. So there you go. I mean, it can be like that, can't it? And that, I mean, my own I have two daughters, and I've got 4 grandchildren. My 2 daughters, one learnt the clarinet, one learnt the flute. Once one of them played for me, and I wouldn't have them play for me. I encouraged it. Yes, they came to concerts, but I wasn't going to force it on them, and I wasn't going to ever do that, because I think that's a great mistake. Because if you force it on, you can almost turn people off it. You've got to find your own level. But as long as the support's there if they want it, and it does help, of course, if parents have got a little bit of understanding about what is necessary, facilities to practice, and of course, understanding that you've got to pay for instruments and all that sort of thing that goes with it. It's difficult, but yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for clarifying everything and what you've told and shared. It's really important that not to force your child or like people into like if you're a musician or a professional musician,
Yes,
because I think
absolutely.
everyone has their own dreams and what they want to pursue in the future.
Well, that photograph is one of my dreams there. Well, the one, it's just gone. The one there was down not far from where you are in Ipswich, because that's in Snake Maltings, my conducting in Snake Maltings for the first time, where the Benjamin Britten's Concert Hall. So there we go.
Ah,
I was at the opening of that hall in 1967, and it took me till about quite a long time. I sang in there, recorded in there, singing for Britain, but that's in Britain's hall that he converted a malt barn into a concert hall for his own performances. Yeah.
all right, thank
The
you.
photograph that just flashed up there was me and Sir Colin Davis, who was a friend of mine for 50 years in the Barbican.
Ah,
That's me and Colin together. And he was just over
wow.
80 there. And he was a great, great mentor and a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful conductor.
Yes, thank you very much. So, after sharing like what inspired you, can you tell us like how you got going as a conductor?
Well, I wanted to. I led a lot of orchestras, violinist. I was a violin, led orchestras, and got frustrated by what conductors who I thought were very good. So I wanted to sort of take over myself. And I also composed a bit, and I made myself. I did my first conducting was conducting my own pieces with the local music groups in Ipswich, and then I went to British Youth Orchestra, leading the seconds, and I put it about that I wanted to conduct, and I had this chance to conduct. I had this chance to conduct the British Youth, and it all went very well. And I took over a bit of a rehearsal and had a go. Because the trouble with conducting is that you don't know you're really good until you stand up in front of an orchestra and do it. I mean, that is the eternal problem. Yeah. All these photographs popping up. I wonder who you all know that. That photograph is me and Sir Malcolm Arnold, who wrote the music for the Bridge on the River Kwai, the famous movie. At any rate, the
Mm,
previous one, that's me and Simon Rattle, who was at the um, we were both at the academy together. Anyway, but
okay.
I mean, yes, and then what I did when I did a lot of singing. Although I played the violin, I sang, and when I went to London, I wanted to join a chorus, and I joined the London Symphony Orchestra chorus, and I sang in that and learnt what it was like to sing for Colin Davis and people like that, Giulini, Previn, and all those people like that, and sang and watched what to do, learnt an enormous amount about what to do. And that's how I got going. And then I managed to get on the Royal Academy conducting course, and did all right there. Get a nice mark there, and got my own orchestra going, North London Symphonia, and Simon Rattle played the timps, and then I went to Sir Adrian Bolt privately after that, and then got into the carry-on competition, things like that. And then very soon got a lot of youth orchestra and amateur orchestra jobs.
Nice. All right. Yes. So, how did you started like out conducting like
Well,
so
I mean,
many?
I auditioned for appointments that were advertised. I mean, I wanted to conduct, so therefore I got an orchestra together at the academy, as I said, so various students would come along. So therefore it gave me a chance to say I'd conducted something, and I'd got a CV therefore that said I'd actually done some work. I mean, that again is the hard thing to do. Then obviously getting a qualification in conducting at the academy was very, very, very useful. And then I won some prizes at the academy for my work, and I also conducted an opera there. I got a good review in the Sunday Times, and so that meant that if I applied for something, I managed to get a chance for an audition. And when I went for the auditions, like I did for Stoney Youth Orchestra, I was appointed their conductor. The Stoney job with the youth orchestra was interesting because it wasn't a very big orchestra. It had been around for a long time, but it was quite small, and it grew. But I went for 3 months, and I ended up being there 42 years. So that was quite extraordinary. So, but that's
Yes.
and then I managed to get other appointments with amateur orchestras of quite a high standard, and we made music, and then got, as I said, to Berlin, and got gradually crawled up this pole of reputation.
Yes. 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 So because you've mentioned the Korean competition, so can you tell us like what happened during the competition in
Yes,
Berlin in
well, indeed.
1995?
It was quite an experience. I had not much luck getting into competitions in this country. I mean, they're pretty awful things, really, because I mean, you don't conduct a whole piece. You don't really have much time to get a relationship with an orchestra. You just do your bit for 10 minutes, and they think you're any good, and You know, the conductor comes on and he goes off. It's a bit like ducks at a fairground, you know, and off goes the next, on comes the next duck. And that is a bit like that. And but then I managed to get accepted for the Karajan. And the one thing about Karajan, he had his own, this was a foundation. I mean, there's a lot of comments about him as a person and what he was like, but for me, he was a very important and very much misunderstood, I think. He had this foundation, and what it meant was that there was an enormous generosity of the number of people that they could accept for this competition. There was 64 conductors were invited that year to take part. And that went on from the Wednesday through to the Sunday. I got to Berlin on the Wednesday. I conducted on the Friday. Of course, this is Berlin still divided in 1975. I walked to the wall, went to Potsdam, went to a performance, spent too much money, conducted the first round. I had to do a bit of Beethoven 8, Enigma variations, and Brahms 2 within the space of half an hour. They then obviously must have liked what I was doing. And I owe a lot of what went on to the fact that on the jury was Gennady Rozhdestvensky, the great Russian conductor. And I think he liked what I was doing. He liked the technique. I think he liked that. That was him with the way he beat time. And then I went on the Sunday, and I went there for see what was going. There was a reception. We all met Karajan and I found myself in the next round. Then I found myself in the following round, and then I found myself whittled down to 4. And it was all extraordinary. You know, I had to borrow money from the British Council to stay more in Berlin because I wasn't expecting to stay, etc., etc. So, you know, there we go. And I got into the final. He was a bit funny with awarding the prizes, but there we go. But I wouldn't have wanted to have won. I did actually get the orchestra's vote to win it. But if I'd have won it, I'd have been out of my depth too soon and that. But that, of course, when I went home, gave me an enormous amount of prestige, you know. So and then I got some broadcasts with the BBC Scottish and did another couple of competitions which weren't so fairly run, you know. And the other thing that was important for me in that Karajan was that the great record producer who was married to Elizabeth Schwarzkopf, Walter Legg. You'll see a lot of ODMI records that were produced by Walter Legg. He was on the jury, and he had a pair of ears. He was not the nicest man the world has ever known by a long shot. He was pretty unpleasant, but he had a pair of ears. And for me, that was the great compliment. And of course, Karajan being there as well, of course it was. And I renewed my acquaintance with Karajan about 15 years later. There's a photo that's just whizzed past when I went to see him when he was ill in Salzburg. I took my orchestra to Salzburg, my youth orchestra, and we gave him an 80th birthday present. And I went up to give it to him, and he said he wanted to speak to my orchestra he said he'd speak to them from the window. So he did this sort of papal balcony appearance, and I held him up because his spinal cancer was so bad that he couldn't stand. And so I had held him up at the window, and there's that photograph that's whizzed past that you've just seen of me holding Karajan up at the window. But that was a great honor, and he was pleased to see me and pleased to hear how we were getting on. But it was great. It was an enormous honor, and it was his money too that was in that competition. He put his money where his mouth was. He gave people a chance. And I'm very grateful for that.
Okay, so about the Karajan competition or any, what made you choose that particular competition to participate?
Well, you would do it to get a break, to get noticed, to get seen. I mean, unless you've got money and you can pay your own orchestra, that's the eternal dilemma. You've either got an orchestra that's sitting pretty, that's waiting for you to do, or you work your way through a youth and amateur orchestra. And that's not always a good thing, because handling a youth orchestra and amateurs is different from handling the LSO, the London Symphony Orchestra, or anything. That's a different kettle of fish. And you do get ingrained in doing that. They don't need so much information. That's different. But the point was that you got a chance for exposure. However paltry it was, it meant that people came to that, and I put that on my CV that I'd done it. So if somebody wanted to employ me, they weren't taking such a risk. I mean, there are a lot of people who say they're conductors. I mean, a great critic over here once called conducting a phony profession. I mean, I do a talk on conducting. If the Martians landed, you're waving your white stick around. What is this man doing? If the Martians landed, came from Mars and waved a white stick around, what is this man doing? I mean, a lot of orchestras can play on their own. You know what I mean? There's all that going on. It's no one's going to give you a chance with the London Symphony Orchestra unless you can prove you can do it. But the problem is proving how you do it. So therefore, if you've been in a competition, it can help you. At least you've done it. You've got somewhere with that, you know. I mean, that did prove to me that Walter Legg, Karajan and Rozhdestvensky thought I was good enough to get that far. you know, good enough and had enough technique and ability to do it, you know. And that meant a lot. That's, I mean, they're not competitions are strange. I mean, you know, you will know that from any instrument that you go with, you know, pianists who win and things like that. You know, I mean, there are many people who were in competitions that well, in fact, the chap who won it the year I was there, I mean, he didn't become very famous, and some of the others didn't. You know, and it's not always the case that anybody. The one famous winner of the carry-on before I went, there was Marius Janssens, who became a very, very famous and very distinguished conductor. But not always the case, because it depends if you're good at doing it. Good doing those. You know, there's a different way. You know.
Yes, yes, but
It's
also it's also very it's also a truth, and it's the reality, like how you get to be known and to be seen in like big shows or any concerts in the halls. I think
it's very difficult, because you're probably going to make a video that might not be recorded very well. I mean, that, you know, you've played that video of that performance in Bromley earlier. I mean, I would probably get the balance a bit better if it was being done in a recording studio. It goes out live, therefore there can be errors. I mean, I thought it was reasonably accurate. I was quite pleased with it. I don't watch my own things, I have to say. I think that's the first time I've watched that through for that much, because I don't like watching myself at all. I mean, perhaps that's it. But I mean, that's the point. It's very difficult to get, because the conditions are not always going to be good for recording. You know, you've got to get a balance right. I mean, you could have somebody record a concert and they just off the cuff and a live one, and it doesn't give much idea about what you can really do. And that's a dilemma. That's a real problem, because you're as good as your orchestra in a way. I mean, you can. I mean, Carrie-Anne said you want to make a third-rate orchestra into a second-rate one. That's the challenge. To make what you've got, make it better than they ever known they could do. And I'd like to think I can do that a bit with a youth orchestra or an amateur, you know, make them better than they ever thought they could play. And that takes technique, it takes rehearsing, it takes a skill to do that. I think it does. And that perhaps that's a skill that I've got, which I haven't got in other. But on the other hand, that's what it's about. But you are very much, when you're trying to be a conductor, you're at the mercy of what you could do, you know. I mean, in many ways too, perhaps, you know, violinists would be a better violin, you know, could show how good they are if they had a Stradivarius, you know. I mean, all that sort of thing, you know, that comes off, you know. But I think it is very difficult with conducting, because you've got you need the players, you need your choir or players, you know.
Yes. Like conducting, you not only bring yourself up, you bring the whole. You bring the whole orchestra, everyone, all the players up. Yeah. And so, do you have to speak like German when you're conducting the orchestra?
Well, no, and this is why I wanted to call the, you know, referred in the talk to the fact that music's an international language. And no, I'm not a German speaker. I knew a few words. I could say rehearsal letters, and I had an interpreter. But of course, in Germany, a lot of people speak English at any rate. In Russia, when I was with the Petersburg Orchestra in 1992, that was a different kettle of fish. That's me and Carrie-Anne. That's holding him up at the window in his room in Salzburg. Bless he was really happy that day. No, I mean, you know, I mean, you could. It's good for conductors not to talk too much, at any rate. If I was restricted, so I would say a lot. You know, you can say Italian in terms of that più piano, più forte, pizzica. You know, and you can. There's an awful lot you can do and gesture without speaking the language. You know, I mean, and that is the point, that music is an international language in that, and that's the great thing about it. It can move us one way or the other, and I can make you play like I did in Japan, make an orchestra play without speaking any Japanese at all, and you can have a successful time and do it that way. But I don't think it's any impediment to have it. I mean, there was that famous story that Mozart, you know, Haydn and Mozart were both approached by the English impresario Salomon to come to London, and Haydn went to London, and when he left, Mozart said to him, "How are you going to get on in London? You know, you don't speak any English." And Haydn said, "My language is understood everywhere." And that was his music, and that's very true. And that's the great thing to do with it all. Yeah. That's a photograph of my dear friend Gennady on my right, and Temnikhanov. I'm afraid Gennady died a couple of years ago, but that's he was a great conductor. But I mean, that's the point. I mean, the great thing about the music is that there is this language. I mean, if only people would realize how important it is that we can all, as people, we don't need the complications of language to actually express ourselves in music. I mean, you can be moved by the end of that Dvorak cello concerto, because it is about about that lady in the middle there in the gold dress is our greatest singer, Dame Janet Baker, very, very famous mezzo soprano, and that man on her right is a rather overweight Adrian Brown. But that's the thing. I mean, you can get people, youngsters in youth orchestras. I mean, in the Philippines, you get them to play the emotion, because their language is somehow that you can bring it out of those black dots and squiggles and goodness knows what on the page. That's important. So I've never found that that's me receiving the Elgar Medal last year with my own Elgar Sinfonia. But the whole business of I mean, it just is so wonderful to be able to get people who don't necessarily understand it and youngsters to experience something that they can't put into words. I mean, Schumann said music is too precise for words, and that is so true, and that's what makes it come over. And I've never worried about the language side of it all, as well. Anyway, there we go. That's how I feel about it. That's Daniel again with another orchestra of mine doing I think that was the Dvorak again. I think he did it again. That's me in a posher suit.
Nice.
So I hope that you understand. I hope that helps you.
Yes, it really helped, and I learned a lot. So, because you're talking about the professional world, can you abbreviate and tell us more about it?
Well, yeah, the professional world. Yeah, I mean, so much is it about money and how you're going to get a date, and you might get the date or the experience or whatever you do, or the concert, through what I would call extra, without outside musical reasons. Whether you look good or what you do. And the professional world can be a bit like that. I mean, you're governed enormously by the amount of what you can actually conduct, a repertoire. That's another factor. I mean, for me in my life, I've got a book with over 1,000 pieces in it I've conducted. I don't say that out of arrogant or being showing. I'm saying because the point is that I've managed to be able, with the orchestras I've had, to be able to choose and pick some repertoire that would not necessarily be popular enough to fill the Royal Festival Hall in London. That's the problem. You've got the criteria of money all the time when it comes to it. And I now have my own orchestra, which is full of very, very they're friends of mine. My new Elgar Sinfonia, most of the players I know personally. And they've been around with me a long time, and they want to play for me, and we play together, and I've got the best possible quality of players I want. I mean, I'm happy with that. I don't want to go to an orchestra whereby, I'd put it this way: I'd much rather come and conduct your orchestra than conduct an orchestra that doesn't want to have a new conductor or wants to play the New World Symphony of Dvorak for the 1,000th time. I'd rather work with people who want to explore music, and not people who are just turning up to play it for a living. I mean, I don't decry it, but unfortunately things have gone a bit like that. Of course, that's a generalization. There's loads of music making that is interesting and invigorating, and things are going on very well. But you've got this problem of you've got to fill a hall. You've got the problem of what should be done and who you engage, and whether what you play. And I'd rather have that limited. That's the problem with the professional world, and that's what it's like. And it can be very cutthroat. It can be very unpleasant. I've known Sir Colin Davis's career all his life, and I was with him. He was music director of the Opera House, and he then went to other orchestras and that. He had a very, very difficult time running the Opera House, very unhappy, and advisors. And I remember he came and conducted my youth orchestra once in Harrow, and we had a wonderful day. And he told us what was going on. He was at Covent Garden. There was meetings here. I remember my wife, we got in the car going home, and she said, "What did you think that Colin said?" And she said, "Do you want that?" And I said, "No, I don't think I do." Do you know what I mean? That was the point. Do I want all that politics? There's enough politics on committees now as it is without that. That's the professional world, and that makes it difficult. But money will be the thing, unless you've got enough money like Carrie-Anne did to run the thing and then artistically really then do what you want to do. That's the problem.
Yes, yes. Not like I've joined orchestra, like my school orchestra when I was in high school. I don't think it's just in the world, like the outside world. Even in schools, we can still see like politics inside.
Oh,
So
goodness.
there's still, I think there's always politics.
Oh, yes, there is. But I mean, but then when money comes into play a lot more, you've got sort of the stakes are higher. That's the point about it all. And of course, I mean, and also too, I mean, it's great too that there is that much amateur music making. I mean, people can. I mean, a lot of my friends are amateur. They play for the fun, but they have a real standard. They take it very seriously. As they take it as seriously, and it can be just as good as anything. And I mean, I would love to emphasize this from how important youth music is, in that I see that this is a corporate thing. This is a body of people. Your orchestra is a group of people, like a team. And that is so important, that people belong. There's far too much worrying about sport and how team games and all this sort of thing. And even that's got now to a certain thing, that money is the most important thing with that. I mean, once upon a time, for instance, the Olympics were full of amateur sportsmen. Not anymore. They've all got all sorts of complicated, whereas, your orchestra is important. I've run orchestras where I've known members, they turn up and they want to play perhaps once a week, or they belong to it. And for them, it means everything to them that they belong to something. There's far too, politicians just sort of dismiss orchestras and choirs and that far too much. There's all talk that my argument all the time with politicians is, please don't get rid of orchestras. Fund them, fund choirs, fund me. Because I have had people in my youth orchestra over the years who've suffered deprivation. They've been abused. And sometimes that's the only time they've come to something on a Sunday to get away from where they lose themselves in that world and be with friends and be part of that team under one conductor. He may be a difficult man, but under that one conductor who is going to actually make them enjoy something as a corporate thing. And that's so important. And it's just not thought about, because people, I'm afraid, are very ignorant. They don't know how it works. They think it's all done on records and things like that. But the actual business of making music is important. This coming weekend, I'm going to play a Vaughan Williams Symphony. We're going to be socially distanced. I go to something called Music Camp. Everybody turns up from all over the country, and they get together because they like playing music as a body. They want to play. They're not worried about whether they would listen to it. It's for them. It's their spiritual experience of delivering that music. And that's what matters. And the next Sunday is just as important a date for me as any other date would be. And as I say, like I went to the Philippines and conducted the Peace Philharmonic in the youngsters in Cebu. Very similar, it looks like, to the school that the wonderful setup that you have. I mean, it was marvelous. It was so inspiring to see these youngsters from all backgrounds, all coming together to make music from wherever they came from, whatever background. No class, no barriers, no nothing. Helping people from poor backgrounds. That's what matters, because that person from a poor background could be somebody really talented who the world then would get to know. And their life can be changed. Their lives can be changed by music.
Yes. So, because we are near to the end of the question, so I'll ask our JPO questions, and maybe we can continue when there's more time. We'll continue what we have in the rest of the questions. So can you tell us, because as you have heard, that the Jesselton Philharmonic Orchestra has involved itself in a variety of activities. So on behalf of the JPO, we would like to ask your views on the JPO and our activities. So additionally, how would you suggest the JPO and its members further improve itself?
Oh, yes. Well, I've seen a performance of the Coriolan Overture. It looks very, very, very inspired, and you look good. The sound is a very good sound. I mean, your work, your work it got to be centered around quality of the actual music that you do. We have this expression, I don't know whether you don't dumb down. We don't want potted arrangements of Harry Potter and potted arrangements of Hamilton and all these things. I've said that earlier, but I mean, I do mean it, because I think in my experience that youngsters actually and people want to get to the substance, get music of substance that they can get, and it will be with them all their lives. I think that's the point. I'm not being too, I don't want to be rude about, but there is certainly an element of some music that here today, gone tomorrow, because people want to be popular. Don't worry about being populist. It's actually rather good to play an overture like Coriolan and get to the grips and get to the Beethoven personality. The Beethoven personality is in that determination, that C minor. I must say, forgive me, but the tempo could be a bit quicker on that one. But there we go. But there we go. but I'm just saying that the point I'm making is that what that's about is about that person. That's what you need to do. And of course, don't get too many youngsters playing too much difficult music too soon, because it can put them off. That's one bit of advice. Just be careful of that. Always, there is always a problem with youth music, and that with that sort of thing is that you've got an orchestra there where your string and woodwind parts are interesting. Sometimes in that music, the brass and drum, there's not much percussion. The trumpet parts are not very exciting, and brass is not very exciting. That's a difficult balance to strike, because when you involve more brass, it inevitably means that the string parts and some things get more difficult. That's a very important thing to bear in mind on repertoire. But go for the good repertoire. Go for it, and you'll be amazed. And go for repertoire too that believe that no, and just because you might think it's not what, like, as older people have their prejudices, try and think that something modern will be just as attractive as something that is sort of established music. I mean, people, you're in audiences, oh goodness me, they're doing Stravinsky, I'm not going to go to that, that's far too modern. Well, that won't have any bearing on youngsters. Your youngsters will take up the discords and the things like that much more, and so be brave and do that. Be brave. It's amazing how that doesn't matter, but I mean, as much outreach as you can do, and to give you. And the other thing I found very, very useful as well is that if you can actually have a situation when you haven't got social distancing, that you have a sort of apprentice scheme, that you have your regular players, and perhaps certainly be brave enough to have another youngster who's not so experienced sitting next to somebody. That's quite a good way of working, to get them used to being played, so they get used to counting bars read, they get used to what it's about. You know what I mean? Things like that. I think that's very important as well. Okay.
Yes. Thank you for sharing.
Keep up the good work. It looks wonderful.
No. Okay. So, because you were talking about how youngsters do and how would you go for it? Because Roland Davis, he asked, how strictly do you believe musicians should follow what is written? Would you change the composer's instruction if your interpretation was like different? Like, would you?
I see myself as Sir Adrian did, as a musical midwife. I'm to bring the piece into the world. It is not, I don't believe in this word, I don't like the word interpretation. My job is to realize the score, to have the score. Now, that of course will depend on the period of music that you're dealing with. If you're dealing with music from 1850 almost to the present day, most composers will give you a pretty strict way of how they want their music to go, not least Elgar, who wrote every dot and quaver, every single thing about how they wanted their music to go. The problem, of course, comes in when you play from Handel, Bach, you're open to all sorts of ways of how you play it, because we're not given the information. It's ironical, actually, that the wheel has come full circle, because the days of the composer being there and organizing the music were Baroque times, and now we've got back to sort of shows and theatre musicals and things where, again, people like Stephen Sondheim and Andrew, they are there again supervising their music again. We went in for 100 years. We went where the composer sort of put the score in an envelope and sent it off to a conductor for him to get on with. That's happened a bit. My own project is to have the utmost respect for the composer as they are writing. Yeah, far too many people have tampered with scores. Far too many people who do that. There is not much you ever need to change in Elgar. Certain composers, you just get to know where their weakness is. I mean, Wagner, for all his wonderful orchestration, Wagner is very, very vague on dynamics. There's quite a lot of editing you would have to do, the Prelude to Tristan, to get the balance right and the dynamics. He will write vague hairpins and things like that. That is not. There are very few who are as specific as Elgar. Mahler, of course, was obsessive. Strauss was very, very detailed on how they wanted it to go, you know. So that's the point. But there are far too many people who play fast and loose with what they did. But that was a generation a long time ago. I mean, people changed orchestration. All conductors like Stokowski years ago, Furtwängler, people like that changed the orchestration in Mahler. Of course, as a conductor, changed the orchestration of Beethoven 9. So I've just got the score of that Beethoven 9 with Mahler's orchestration of it all and how he changed it. It's phenomenal. We wouldn't dream of doing that now, but we're much more purified and we're much more pure in our approach. You know.
Okay, thank you very much. And from YouTube, so Mike London asked, what is the preparation process for a conductor to put off a show?
Well, the preparation, first of all, it's a good idea to learn the piece as best you can. I'm not a pianist. I don't play. If I know the piece in my head, at any rate, it's good that I should be able to hear that score in my head. With some parts have just arrived for me to work on. We've got to get something done for the Prelude to the Master Singers, and I've got to get a set of parts worked out. My preparation means that my score is marked up with the bowings and phrasings that I want, breathing that I want. I would organize that within my score. And that comes with experience. I might change a few things over the time, but I've got my way of doing it. I would then prepare a master copy of those bowings, and they will be transferred into the parts for everybody to play, and the set will be completely marked. That's a lot of work. That goes back to a tradition of Sir Henry Wood running the proms where there was very little rehearsal time. I mean, I've got one of his Sir Henry Wood scores where his blue pencil is all over it, telling the players what to do and how to do it and get round, because some things you need you to say, is it in 4 or is it in 2? Things like that. That's important. That saves time. That means in rehearsal, you can get on with it. I'm doing this Vaughan Williams Symphony on Sunday. Every part has been marked by me, and my wife has done some duplications of bowings. Every part is marked up, because that means that we don't have to talk about it. We get on with it, and you prepare it that way. A lot of people don't do that, but great conductors, Sir Neville Marriner, not a great, as it were, a great conductor, a great man with the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields, got wonderful playing, and he got wonderful play. I played for Neville a couple of times in the Academy, and everything was meticulously marked up and bowed, and that's how he got the standard of playing he did. Then you begin, having made that lovely cake of the orchestra of the piece, you then can put the icing on as you want it to go. But you've got to make the cake first, and you've got to know how to cook the cake, and you've got to know how to do that from the point of view of knowledge. Knowledge is important about what you do when you learn a score. But I wouldn't worry too much about playing on the piano. If you can hear it in your head, try and discipline so you can do as I do years ago, sit on a bus and listen to the score in your head. You know, you have the score open and sing away in your head to it. It's a good idea to get an inner ear developed that you can hear how things are.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. So another one from Roland Davis again. So he said, hi, how would you think today's players and conductors compare with the greats from 50 to 100 years ago? I'm interested both in technique and in musical understanding, which may have developed differently.
Well, it's interesting that we think we've got the better and the greatest orchestras probably at the moment. And there is the essence of the virtuoso conductor who can do things. We will never know really what the standard was like of things. Wouldn't we love to know what the first performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony actually sounded like? I mean, there are lots of people who do authentic things. But we know that Beethoven was deaf, stood in front of the orchestra, had to be turned around to receive the applause. He was half in charge, and the leader was half in charge. What was it like? We will never know. There are other instances of that with performances too. What was the technique of conductors like? Well, you know, they must have been able to do things with their baton as conductors that were actually playable. If the orchestras couldn't play the things as well, I don't think Strauss and Mahler would have actually written quite such difficult music in the 1890s, Heldenleben. So the standard was high. We have a few snippets of recording. We always tend to think that things have got better. I like listening to older people. I'm very fond of a conductor called Carl Böhm, and I've got a box of recordings of him recording with the Dresden Orchestra just before the Second World War. The standard of playing is phenomenal. You tend to think it might be a bit old-fashioned, but there was that discipline there of those people. And I think one of the things that these conductors did in those days, as well as the players, is they came up through the ranks. They were worked in opera houses. What is the problem nowadays is a young conductor can get given something to do where he hasn't got the experience. And there is no substitute, in my opinion, for experience, either as a player or as a conductor, or for that matter, as a composer. I don't think a 21-year-old composer necessarily wants his piece played by the London Symphony Orchestra in the Festival Hall. He wants to get it played where he can learn. And I think that's a lot in that. But because it's got very much youngsters, let's give them a star position. Karajan was a famous conductor, but he did his years rowing the boat in the galley. He did his years in opera houses in the middle of nowhere, learning the repertoire. He said he conducted Rosenkavalier, and he did a wonderful recording of it. But he said there's a great, the Rosenkavalier is a 3-hour opera with a character called Baron Ochs in it. And he had to do it in a German opera house in the 1930s. And the singer, he discovered, couldn't read music. And he had to teach the bloke it verbatim, like rote. And he said, I knew every note of that piece. And that's how they grew up with it. And I think that growing up with it, that greatness of being there, doing it, meant that when we listened to Karajan doing Rosenkavalier or Böhm or that generation doing it, they were doing it with years of experience. I know one conductor who remained nameless who actually recorded the Ring of Wagner, but he never conducted it completely in the opera house. I find that absurd. I think that's absurd. I think that's crazy. You need to know that to get to know how you do something from beginning to end. And that's an experience. But what was the technique like? I mean, we know that Hans Richter, I'll finish on this little anecdote. Hans Richter, German conductor, friend of Wagner, conducted the first Ring cycle in Bayreuth, 1876. Richter was given the job of conducting Elgar's Dream of Gerontius in 1900. He found it hard to conduct. The performance was not a success. He was pacing up and down the night before, learning to conduct the score. Now, my answer to that is, I wonder what that first Ring cycle was like in 1876. Because if he found Gerontius hard to conduct, I wonder what you see, we don't know about that standard. We have myths and legends of people. And these legends and what they were like, we don't know. That's the problem. But are there Karajans and Carl Böhms and Colin Davises around at the moment? I doubt it. I don't think so. There are a few very, very talented conductors around, but when it comes to the standard classics, will we replace listening to perhaps Karajan or Monteur or people like that as conductors? I'm not so sure. I don't know. They're in Britain. We have Edward Gardner, who is fantastically talented as a conductor, marvelous, very, very wonderful man. And in the States, there are, but I'm because a lot of it's about PR and things like that. I don't know. Who am I to judge?
Yep, no problem. Thank you very much. And our last question from YouTube. So it's anonymous. So that person said, "Hi, as a seasoned conductor who has decades of conducting experience, what are your greatest changes? Like, what are the greatest changes have you seen over the past few decades?"
I'm certainly seasoned. Certainly 50 years doing this. What have I seen? Oh, I think one very important thing is the development of what I would call authentic classical and Baroque. That's been important. That was beginning when I was a student, and it was called the Cobweb Brigade, and it was rather derived. We called it was all about cobwebs and old people and that's influenced us, because I think although we might not want to play with no vibrato, we might not want to ignore the no vibrato, the speeds, the articulation, and perhaps we might want not the instruments. You can't deny that it's influenced the way conductors have approached that period of music from Beethoven through Beethoven, Brahms, and all that. I think that's been important. That's a big change. We would not have worried about that in 1970s. We would have gone on and tried to do our stuff like Sir Adrian would have done, and that in that way. Although it has to be said that people like Carrie-Anne were doing a lot of fast tempos in Beethoven, for instance, in the 60s and 70s at any rate. There was a lot of that going on. But I think, though, it's interesting how I am now more aware that if I do an adagio by Mozart, I'm more aware, like in the Mozart 39, that the tempo should not be quite such a romantic way of doing the music. That's changed. What has changed in the youth orchestra side of it all, which I think is about education, what I fear is that what has not got so good is the actual ability of people to read the music. And I think there's been a very much a disappointment on how that has come about. No, I'm not being very clear. When my youth orchestra, when I was in 1970, we were in the heyday of Stoneleigh, we would be able to sight read pieces. Nowadays, people's ability to sight read, for some reason, is not as good as it was. And I think I'm having to, these days, teach people how to read the music more than I did, which I find, because I think what's happened is that the education of music has become less theoretical and become more about the ear and composing and doing it by ear in that way. Now, you could say it's a good or bad thing, but at the end of the day, if you want to enjoy music and you want to be able to play in a string quartet, or you want to have a double bass to play the trout quintet thing, you want to play the double bass part, it's good that you've got the ability to read it. Sight read, do you know what I mean? And you can make music.
Yes.
And I think that's important. And I think that's slipped. And that's a big change, because the orchestras I've got now can't sight read as well as they could when I started out. And that was very much a British tradition too. A lot of recordings were done in London, because the British tradition was that they could read, because there was never any rehearsal time. So they had to behave like that in the first place. Do you see what I mean? So that was important as well.
Yes.
I think that's the major repertoire. Yes, a lot of delving into repertoire that's not been done. More British music that's not been done. Opening up the CDs of produced possibilities for things to be recorded, which otherwise haven't done. Yeah, a big change.
Yes, I think there's lots to improve, and you're right about listening, playing. Like, it's more relying on our ears, because I have this bad, very, very bad habit of just listening. Yeah. And it really affects the way of sight reading. So yep.
Well,
I agree with
listening.
What you said.
I mean, good for you that you're listening to your colleagues around, because that in its essence is a way of chamber music and making music together. That's a good thing. But I mean, you've got the point about it is that they have the skill to be able to get through a part and to be able to read it in that way is very, very important. And to open yourself. I mean, to all sorts of music. I mean, when I went to the academy, I saw 50 operas in my first year at the academy. I went to everything that moved. Now I can get conducting students over. Some conducting student was around the other day and came and they'd never seen a Wagner opera. Well, I think you need to get out more and do it and listen. There's CDs everywhere. There's everything. People, it's amazing the amount of, I can stand in front of a youth orchestra and say, has anybody listened to this piece? And nobody's listened to it. And I think, well, when I was 16, I was listening to everything that moved. That's it, like a piece of blotting paper, soaking up the music, So and because they're the years you need to do it, because that's where my memory is. My memory goes back to all that music that I learned when I was very, very young, I can remember what I was conducting when I was 16, as opposed to what I was doing 16 months ago. Because our memory is like that,
Yes, agree. So, all right. So we are. So thank you so much, Adrian, for your responses and for telling us so much of your knowledge and your experience. So, but sorry, everyone, we are coming to the end of tonight's broadcast. We would like to remind everyone that our JPO family program will be broadcasted twice a week until further notice. Join us next time with our next guest as will be posted near the time. More details can be found on our Facebook page. A video recording of tonight's broadcast will also be available on the YouTube channel along with past webinars and the soon to be broadcasted interviews. So feel free to share the Zoom webinar registration link, JPO YouTube channel, and the JPO Facebook page with friends and family. For our YouTube audience, if you're enjoying our program, please show your support by pressing the like and subscribe button down below. You guys have been an amazing audience. We from JPO family wishes that everyone stays safe and healthy as facing this crisis together. So I will lead the prayer to end tonight's program. Please pray in whatever faith you believe in regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the wonderful time that we had during this interview. I pray that you bless Adrian abundantly in all his career and music path, no matter present or in the future. We pray that everyone staying strong during this pandemic and give us strength to overcome during this difficult time. We pray for the frontliners and those who must travel to work, as God, you provide protection and healthy bodies to fight this pandemic. I thank you, Lord, for everything you provide. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight. And thank you, Adrian, for sharing such a wonderful topic with us tonight. So we'll see everyone next time. Good night.
Good night.